Was Vatican II really the greatest event in the life of the Church? That moment when we finally got Catholicism right after 2,000 years of messing it up? Has the almost total collapse of the Church since the Council happened simply because the Council was implemented poorly? Well, let's take a look and see.
Boomer's Church, entertaining and enlightening stories, interviews, analysis, and everything else about life in the Church before, during, and after the Council. Boomer's Church with your host, Edward Schaefer, starts now.
Since Vatican Council II, there has been a veritable collapse of the Church. By every gauge the Church uses to measure her health, she is in poorer health today than she was prior to the Council. Now, I won't go into all the statistical details. You can find them in a lot of places, including this little book that I wrote. Wasn't that clever? It's not expensive, and you can order it in the link in the description. Now, to be fair, it's impossible clinically to say that everything that has happened since Vatican Council II is the fault of the Council. The situation is too complex for that simple of an analysis. But it is certainly accurate to say that the Council and its reforms have done absolutely nothing to impede the Church's implosion. And indeed, the Council and its reforms may have played at least some, perhaps a major, role in this bloodbath. But there are those who say, no, it isn't so. The Council was intended to bring a springtime to the Church. It just wasn't implemented properly. Well, Vatican II's documents are certainly among the most voluminous and wide-ranging in the history of ecumenical councils, not just in quantity, but in scope and style. They were filled with ambiguities, such that one might be tempted to claim that it's difficult to know exactly what some of them mean, which in turn would make it difficult to implement them properly. But this would be a generous interpretation, one that is beyond the truth. In a preparatory meeting in 1961 of the Commission on the Liturgy, that is, the commission that prepared the liturgy document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, for Vatican Council II, the following statement was made, most likely by Annibale Bonini, the secretary of the commission. It would be most inconvenient for articles of our Constitution to be rejected by the Central Commission or by the Council itself. That is why we must tread carefully and discreetly. Carefully so that proposals be made in an acceptable manner, or, in my opinion, formulated in such a way that much is said without seeming to say anything. Let many things be said in embryo, and in this way, let the door remain open to legitimate, or perhaps legal, and possible post-conciliar deductions and applications. Let nothing be said that suggests excessive novelty and might invalidate all the rest, even what is straightforward and harmless. We must proceed discreetly. Not everything is to be asked or demanded from the Council. The essentials, the fundamental principles. This is a striking statement. It suggests an explicit awareness of the ambiguity, or at least the openness, built into the text of conciliar documents, and that this ambiguity, or openness, was intentional. in order to allow a wide-ranging implementation of these documents after the Council. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. In the dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, we see this phrase: "The Church of Christ, constituted and organized in the world as a society, subsists in the Catholic Church." Now, the Church has always taught clearly and unequivocally that the Catholic Church, established by Jesus Christ, is the one true Church, outside of which there is no salvation. Wait, does this mean anyone who's not a Catholic cannot go to heaven? No, that's not what it means. But it's a complex matter, and I don't want to get sidetracked. Maybe another time. The point here is that whatever this new language says, that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, it does not seem to say what has been documented as church teaching since the 3rd century, that the Church of Christ consists of the Catholic Church. Yes, there are arguments that contend the phrase confirms historical church teaching by using the verb subsist in a classical philosophical manner. And yes, in 2000, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith clarified misconceptions about the Church of Christ subsisting in the Catholic Church and affirmed unchanging church teaching about the nature of the Church. But in spite of this, the phrase is generally interpreted by laity and clerics alike to mean that while the Catholic Church may have the fullness of the truth, other religions share in that truth to the extent that they may be viable pathways to salvation. It's something like a Venn diagram with the Catholic Church in the middle and various other religions overlapping the Church in different ways with various bits of the truth of the Catholic Church. And all of them create a kind of network of world religions, any part of which leads to heaven. Well, this raises the critical question of the topic. Why would the framers of this document use such ambiguous language? They were theologians who knew the teaching of the Church, who knew the language that had been used in past centuries to express this teaching precisely and concisely. It's not reasonable to think that the language is an error. If it were, it would have been corrected. The language was intentional. It is reasonable to conclude that the language was intended to create a kind of obfuscation of the truth, using that methodology of ambiguity that was laid out by Annibale Bugnini in the 1961 statement I mentioned earlier. This ambiguity would allow the implementers of the document to create a change in church teaching, at least operationally, if not efficiently. And this change in church teaching would embrace one of the overarching goals of the Council, ecumenism. But not an ecumenism in the historical sense, that is, a dialogue with other religions for the purpose of converting souls to Catholicism, that pathway given to us by Jesus Christ. Rather, it was a new kind of ecumenism, one in which the Catholic Church would accommodate her teachings to other religions. Indeed, such a change in church teaching, a new vision of the Church, is exactly what happened among laity and clerics, as I just mentioned, and even to the level of the papacy, with Pope Francis declaring that all religions are a pathway to God, and that the diversity of religious identities is a gift of God. Now think about that. Religions that reject Catholic teaching, reject the teachings of the Church established by Jesus Christ, are a gift of God. And Pope Leo, recently meeting in the Vatican with about a dozen leaders of various religions, all offering prayers of their own religions in an event that was generally seen as a kind of symbolic gesture promoting, a type of universalism. Now, I'm not saying that only Catholics can pray. What I am saying is that since at least the 3rd century, the Church has taught that before Jesus Christ ascended into heaven, he left a pathway for us to come to the Father through him, as John puts it in his Gospel. And that pathway is the church that he established, the Catholic Church, that teaches his ways, that governs according to his teachings, and that sanctifies through the sacraments he instituted specifically for the purpose of sanctification. The Church has also consistently taught that other religions, all of which reject at least some of the teachings of the Catholic Church, otherwise they wouldn't be other religions, are not, cannot be that pathway. This is not religious arrogance. It's simple logic by virtue of the principle of non-contradiction. If the church that teaches one thing is the pathway to heaven, then a religion that rejects that same thing cannot also be a pathway to heaven. But here we are, with a new vision of the church, a new and revolutionary church teaching, engendered by the ambiguous language in the document Lumen Gentium. While this new teaching, again affected operationally if not officially, may not be correct, it cannot be said to be the result of poor implementation of the document. Rather, it seems to be an implementation that was executed according to plan and perfectly so. Here's a second example where the ambiguous language of a Vatican II document allows, or perhaps promotes, behaviors that in turn result in changes in church beliefs or teachings. Again, if not officially, then operationally. And again, it would seem intentionally so. In Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the liturgy, we see the following. The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as especially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. Well, yes, Gregorian chant is especially suited to the Roman liturgy. Indeed, it was created specifically for the Roman liturgy, and it is the official music of the Roman liturgy. However, to say this in the context of other things being equal implies that there may well be circumstances in which Gregorian chant is not especially suited to the Roman Mass. Well, the next sentence of the document affirms this. It says, but other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony. Now note the clever insertion here of the reference to polyphony, which seems to imply that the phrase other kinds of music means polyphony in the traditional sense. But that's not what it says. It just says other kinds of music. Another example of saying much while seeming to say nothing. But other kinds of music, other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony, are by no means excluded from liturgical celebrations, so long as they accord with the spirit of the liturgical action as laid down in Article 30. Well, what is Article 30? The spirit of liturgical action laid down in Article 30 is, to promote active participation, the people should be encouraged to take part by means of acclamations, responses, psalmody, antiphons, and songs, as well as by actions, gestures, and bodily attitudes. And at the proper times, all should observe a reverent silence. That's a lot of verbiage to say that Gregorian chant can be replaced in the Mass if the music replacing it encourages active participation. In addition, the permission granted here says nothing about preserving the official texts of the Missal, which the chants of the Mass are. Here's another example of Bugnini's admonition to say much without seeming to say anything. So not only is it permissible to change the music, it's also permissible to change the texts of the Mass, as long as doing so promotes active participation. Now, the text of the Mass had been sacrosanct in practice since at least the 7th and 8th centuries, and affirmed as such by Pope Pius V in the 16th century, precisely because they express the truths of the faith and they transmit the deposit of faith. Now, this permission does not say that it's permissible to change the truths of the faith or to change the deposit of faith. It just implies that you can change the text of the Mass. And the only condition that guides the choice of texts is the active participation of the congregation. Just think about the number of hymns composed by Protestant theologians that are sung, not just in Novus Ordo Masses, but sadly in many traditional Latin Masses where hymns are sung during processions at the beginning and end of Mass. Yes, these Masses are infused with Protestant, anti-Catholic texts. Aside from the fact that this permission allowed music in the liturgy that was both musically questionable and theologically Protestant, it opened the door to random changes to the Mass in order to promote active participation. Within a few years, virtually every text of the Mass was changed in the New Mass. And in many places in the New Mass, priests were given permission to ad lib, that is, express something in these or similar words. Now, am I making much ado about nothing? Were these changes simply new ways of expressing unchangeable truths? Or were they changes in church theology, changes in church teaching, changes that were brought about specifically because of the ambiguous language that allowed radical innovations in the liturgy following the Council? Well, there are more than a few clues to answer this question. In the first edition of the New Mass, the general instruction, that document that accompanies the Missal, discusses the Mass and gives instructions on how to say the Mass. The Mass was defined by this first edition of the general instruction as this way. The Lord's Supper, or Mass, is the sacred meeting or congregation of the people of God, the priest presiding, to celebrate the memorial of the Lord. This definition redefines the Mass as a meal, a memorial of the Last Supper. It stands in stark contrast to the historical, unchanged teaching of the Church that the Mass is the sacrifice in the new law in which Christ, through the ministry of the priest, offers himself to God in an unbloody manner under the appearances of bread and wine. Well, it is true that the Vatican insisted that this definition was in error and that the general instruction be amended in the following edition to reflect the Church's traditional definition of the Mass. And the definition was changed. But nothing in the new Mass that led to the generation of this new definition was changed. The new Mass was conceived as a meal. And this is confirmed by several sources. I'm just going to give you two. First, the new Mass was remarkably similar to the communion service written by Thomas Cranmer for the recently established Church of England in 1549, which was written, this communion service was written with the intention of expunging any notion of sacrifice from the service and reframing it as a meal. We can go into the details of that another time. Second, in 1973, the Superior Consistory of the Church of the Augsburg Confession of Alsace and Lorraine, a major Lutheran authority, publicly acknowledged their willingness to take part in the Catholic Eucharistic celebration. They wouldn't quite use the word Mass, because it allowed them to use these new Eucharistic prayers with which they felt at home, because they had the advantage, these new Eucharistic prayers had the advantage of giving a different interpretation to the theology of sacrifice than they were accustomed to attribute to Catholicism. Well, it would seem that the new Mass does express a new theology, one that was constructed with an eye toward the new ecumenism I mentioned earlier, an ecumenism that was not meant to convert non-Catholics to Catholicism, but one that was meant to accommodate Catholicism to non-Catholics. This was affirmed by Pope Francis in 2021 when he declared, "The liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II, in conformity with the decrees of the Vatican Council II, are the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite." That is to say, the former books, including the Missal of the traditional Latin Mass, are no longer acceptable expressions of the Roman Rite. The Catholic World Report in 2022 explained this by noting that Pope Francis, by revoking permission for widespread access to the Old Mass, has suggested that the two forms of the Mass have irreconcilable differences. Well, how can they have irreconcilable differences if they embrace and reflect the same theology? They cannot. Indeed, the new Mass embraces a new theology to the point that, according to the Holy Father, it's incompatible with the Mass instituted by Christ, developed by the apostles according to the ways of right worship taught to them by Christ, beautifully embellished in the early centuries of the Church, and carefully preserved since the 8th century. So back to the major question of this episode. Was this just the result of poor implementation? Were such radical changes in church teaching and theology never intended? All the council wanted was just a little more active participation. Well, there were no corrections following the council, corrections that would have thwarted an incorrect implementation or incorrect shift in church teaching or theology. In fact, the 1967 document Musicam Sacram, which gave specific instructions for the application or the implementation of the conciliar document, strongly reinforced the principles outlined in the document. And every pope since the council has embraced and reinforced the changes in the Mass, and therefore the changes in theology as the new norm of Catholic belief and worship. Again, it would seem that the implementation of the document was executed exactly according to plan, and perfectly so. So whatever we might say about Vatican Council II, we cannot say that the reforms that followed the Council were different than intended by the conciliar documents. They were exactly what the documents ordered. Food for thought.